crowd brought Jesus into the high priest's house, but Peter was following at a distance. When they kindled a fire in the middle of the courtyard and sat down together, Peter sat among them. Then a servant girl, seeing Peter in the firelight, stared at him and said,
"This man also was with him."
But Peter denied it, saying,
"Woman, I do not know him."
A little later, someone asked, on seeing Peter, said,
"You also were one of them."
But Peter said,
"Man, I am not."
Then about an hour later, still another kept insisting,
"Surely this man also was with the prisoner, for he is a Galilean."
But Peter said,
"Man, I do not know what you are talking about."
At that moment, while Peter was still speaking, the cock crowed. The Lord turned and looked at Peter. Then Peter remembered the word of the Lord, how Jesus had said to him,
"Before the cock crows today, you will deny me 3 times."
And Peter went out and wept bitterly. Now the men who were holding Jesus began to mock him and beat him. They also blinded him and kept asking him,
"Prophesy, who is it that struck you?"
They kept heaping many other insults on Jesus. When day came, the assembly of the elders of the people, both chief priests and scribes, gathered together, and they brought Jesus to the council. They said,
"If you are the Messiah, tell us."
Jesus replied,
"If I tell you, you will not believe, and if I question you, you will not answer. But from now on, the Son of Man will be seated at the right hand of the power of God."
All of them asked,
"Are you then the Son of God?"
Jesus said to them,
"You say that I am."
Then they said,
"What further testimony do we need? We have heard it ourselves from his own lips."
Then the assembly rose as a body and brought Jesus before Pilate. They began to accuse Jesus, saying,
"We found this man perverting our nation, forbidding us to pay taxes to the emperor, and saying that he himself is the Messiah, a king."
Then Pilate asked Jesus,
"Are you the king of the Jews?"
Jesus answered.
"You say so."
Then Pilate said to the chief priests and the crowds,
"I find no basis for an accusation against this man."
But they were insistent and said,
"He stirs up the people by teaching throughout all Judea, from Galilee where he began, even to this place."
When Pilate heard this, he asked whether the man was a Galilean. And when he learned that Jesus was also Herod's jurisdiction, Pilate sent Jesus off to Herod, who was himself in Jerusalem at the time. When Herod saw Jesus, he was very glad, for he had been wanting to see him for a long time, because he had heard about Jesus and was hoping to see him perform some sign. Herod questioned him at some length, but Jesus gave no answer. The chief priests and scribes stood by, vehemently accusing him. Even Herod, with his soldiers, treated Jesus with contempt and mocked him. Then Herod put on an elegant robe on Jesus and sent him back to Pilate. That same day, Herod and Pilate became friends with each other, because they had been enemies. Pilate called together the chief priests, the leaders, and the people, and said to them,
"You brought me this man as one who was perverting the people, and here I have examined him in your presence, and have not found this man guilty of any of your charges against him. Neither has Herod, for he sent him back to us. Indeed, this man has done nothing to deserve death. I will therefore have him flogged and release him."
Then the elders all shouted out together,
"Away with this fellow! Release Barabbas for us!"
Barabbas was a man who had been put in prison for an insurrection that had taken place in the city and for murder. Pilate wanted to release Jesus, addressing them again, but they kept shouting,
"Crucify him! Crucify him!"
A third time Pilate said to them,
"Why? What evil has he done? I have found in him no ground for the sentence of death. I will therefore have him flogged and then release him."
But the elders kept urgently demanding with loud shouts that Jesus should be crucified, and their voices prevailed. So Pilate gave his verdict that the demand should be granted. Pilate released the man they asked for, the one who had been put in prison for insurrection and murder, and he handed Jesus over as they wished. As they led Jesus away, they seized a man, Simon of Cyrene, who was coming from the country, and they laid a cross on him and made him carry it behind Jesus. A great number of people followed him, and among them were women who were beating their breasts and wailing for him. But Jesus turned to them and said,
"Daughters of Jerusalem, do not weep for me, but weep for yourselves and for your children. For the days are surely coming when they will say, 'Blessed are the barren, and the wombs that never bore, and the breasts that never nursed.' Then they will begin to say to the mountains, 'Fall on us,' and to the hills, 'Cover us.' For if they do this when the wood is green, what will happen when it is dry?"
2 others also, who were criminals, were led away and put to death with Jesus.
Please stand.
When they came to the place that was called the Skull, they crucified Jesus there with the criminals, one on his right and one on his left. Then Jesus said,
Father, forgive them, for they do not know what they are doing.
And then they cast lots to divide his clothing, and the people stood by watching. But the leaders scoffed at him, saying,
He saved others, let him save himself. If he is the Messiah of God, his chosen one.
The soldiers also mocked him, coming up and offering him sour wine and saying,
If you are the king of the Jews, save yourself.
There was also an inscription over Jesus that read, This is the King of the Jews. One of the criminals who were hanging there kept deriding Jesus and saying,
Are you not the Messiah? Save yourself and us.
But the other rebuked him, saying,
Do you not fear God, since you are under the same sentence of condemnation? And we indeed have been condemned justly, for we are getting what we deserve for our deeds. But this man has done nothing wrong.
Then he said,
Jesus, remember me when you come into your kingdom.
Jesus replied,
Truly I tell you, today you will be with me in paradise.
It was now about noon, and darkness came over the whole land until 3 in the afternoon, while the sun's light failed, and the curtain of the temple was torn in two. Then Jesus, crying with a loud voice, said,
Father, into your hands I commend my spirit.
Having said this, he breathed his last. When the centurion saw what had taken place, he praised God and said,
Certainly this man was innocent.
When all the crowds who had gathered there for the spectacle saw what had taken place, they returned home, beating their breast. But all Jesus' acquaintances, including the women who had followed him from Galilee, stood at a distance, watching these things. Now there was a good and righteous man named Joseph, who, through a member of the council, had not agreed to the plan in action. He came from a Jewish town called Arimathea, and he was waiting expectantly for the kingdom of God. This man went to Pilate and asked for the body of Jesus. Then Joseph took the body down, wrapped it in a linen cloth, and laid it in a rock-hewn tomb where no one had ever been laid. It was the day of the preparation, and the Sabbath was beginning. The women who had come with Jesus from Galilee followed, and they saw the tomb and how the body was laid. Then they returned and prepared spices and ointments. On the Sabbath they rested according to the commandment. The Gospel of the Lord.
Please be seated.